Welcome to today's event, Voting, Catholicism, and the 2020 Election, with Catholic Bishop of San Diego, Robert McElroy. I'm David DeCosse, the Director of Religious and Catholic Ethics at the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics at Santa Clara University, the Jesuit University in Silicon Valley. We're really so delighted to have Bishop McElroy with us, and we welcome everyone from Santa Clara University and from across the country and elsewhere in the world to this very important conversation in this very consequential year. And I'm really delighted also to be able to host our university president, Jesuit Father Kevin O'Brien, who will introduce Bishop McElroy. Father O'Brien.
Thanks, David. And we're so delighted to have our listeners, both from the university and our friends well beyond, on this very important topic today, as we come within 2 weeks of the election of 2020. Perhaps perhaps like no other year, the Catholic vote has been getting lots of attention on social media and beyond. Polarization in our nation has seeped and sometimes steamrolled into polarization among and in our faith communities. So untangling politics and faith-filled discernment in voting is what brings us together today. And we could not have a better guide on this topic of faith and politics and discerning your vote than Bishop Robert McElroy of the Diocese of San Diego. Bishop McElroy is a preeminent theologian, a political scientist, and a committed proponent of Catholic social teaching as a constitutive element of our faith. He has spoken and written extensively on Catholic social teaching and moral theology. In his priestly ministry, he served as Vicar General in the Archdiocese of San Francisco. He was pastor of St. Gregory Parish up the road in San Mateo and was auxiliary bishop of the Archdiocese of San Francisco before becoming bishop in San Diego in 2015. He's currently the vice president of the California Catholic Conference and serves on the National Conference of Catholic Bishops, on the Administrative Committee, the Ecumenical Committee, the Committee on Domestic Justice, and the Committee on International Affairs. And he is well credentialed to serve in those roles, having degrees in American history, a bachelor's in American history from Harvard, and an MA in American history from Stanford, but of course, and then a doctorate in political science from Stanford. But I know Bob will agree his most cherished degrees are from the two Jesuit institutions. He has a licentiate of sacred theology from the Jesuit School of Theology, our school up in Berkeley, and a doctorate in moral theology from the Jesuits Gregorian University in Rome. Bishop McElroy is a native son of the Bay Area, but he's also a very good friend of Santa Clara University. Of course, he's an alumnus of JST, and last year I awarded him an honorary degree from the Jesuit School of Theology. But his ties actually go way back when he was pastor of St. Gregory's up in San Mateo, when he would come to the Markkula Center and to campus to a theological ethics reading group at the Ethics Center. Bob also, Bishop McElroy also served on the board of directors of our Jesuit School of Theology. So Bishop, we are so happy for your friendship over these years. We are so happy, we are so grateful for your deep thinking on the practical applications of theology and the common good. And we are so edified by the example of your humble ministry as bishop. So please join me in welcoming Bishop McElroy to our university.
Thank you so much, Father O'Brien. And welcome, Bishop McElroy. It's great to see you again. Great to have you with us again in this conversation. And I thought I'd start by picking up a little of Father O'Brien's biographical information, where he noted you have a PhD in moral theology, a PhD in political science. You're the bishop of the 8th largest city in the United States in terms of population. And you have recently called the election we're looking at the most consequential in this country in the last 50 years. Could you say what you've meant by that, please?
Sure. First of all, thank you, Father O'Brien, for that warm welcome. It's always good to be back and with Santa Clara. Yes, I do think this is a uniquely important election in modern times. And I'd say a couple of dimensions point to that. One is that if we look back over the candidates in recent years, say over the past 30 years or so, that when people looked at those candidates, they would have strong preferences, one or another. But in this campaign, people look on the choice, on the one they're choosing against, as cataclysmic. That if that person is elected, it's a cataclysm for our country. So that's a difference. The second thing is, we've never had an election in my lifetime, and really haven't since the Civil War, in which the notion that there might not be a peaceful transition of power after the election has any currency whatsoever. We've never had an election in my lifetime like that, where that's even posed as a possible reality, where the great challenge and threat to our country may well not lie in leading up to the election, but in what flows from the election. And that our country is divided horribly along the lines of race and class and culture and ethnicity, and in ways that are going to be very difficult to heal, and in ways that are affecting not just who wins here, but how the election is perceived in terms of its legitimacy. So for all of those reasons, this is an election unlike any other in my lifetime, and in destructive ways.
Thank you. And we're here today, especially, of course, to talk about the Catholic engagement with the political sphere in this particular election. And you've also said and used this powerful phrase that you think a Catholic voter in the United States is automatically homeless in terms of current sort of party structures. Yeah. Could you comment on that? I think that helps set us up for a kind of larger conversation here.
Yeah, Catholic social teaching is very broad. It is the whole range of issues that seek to encapsulate what we call in theology the common good, which really means the good of every person and every group in society, their ability to attain the maximum as we can accomplish it, their well-being, their development, and that common good embraces a whole range of issues, everything from abortion and climate change, restorative justice, issues of race, issues of war and peace, issues of religious liberty, issues of euthanasia and assisted suicide, issues of economic imbalances, which are enormous within our society, healthcare. These are all part of Catholic social teaching. And in the Catholic vision, there's a unity to that teaching. And the Catholic conscience is developed in light of that unity. The primary commitment of the Catholic conscience in Catholic social teaching is to a broad unity of teachings which sees the advancement of the gospel of Jesus Christ as a primary mandate for Catholics that reaches across the whole spectrum of political moral issues. And those issues I mentioned in particular. The problem is that as the parties have played out over the last 30 years, and really it is over the last 30 years, that there is just a pronounced bifurcation of Catholic social teaching, of that broad vision of the common good. And the Republican Party is more likely to advance those elements of the common good, which focus on abortion, euthanasia, some elements of religious liberty. And the Democratic Party is more likely to engage those elements of the common good, which focus on climate change, racial justice, issues of poverty and the distribution of wealth, healthcare, those elements. So you cannot find a consistent Catholic candidate. You can't even find a candidate who embodies the positions and the character and the competence and the leadership qualities of even 70% of what Catholic social teaching advances. Thus, every time a Catholic voter with a sensitive Catholic conscience votes, they're making a change where they're choice where they're giving up a substantial elements of the issues that are important to them. So it's that bifurcation, which was not true when I was very young. There was always some level to it, but it was not like this. Because there were more moderates in terms of political life. There was more room for moderate positions. In part, it is because the primaries have become such filtration systems that they wipe out moderates. And at lower levels, the processes of reapportionment wipe out moderates too. So this has increasingly occurred. The other thing is, along the lines that makes it so difficult, is that our politics is very tribal now. There was an article in Atlantic in the 60s, and it asked the question, would you be extremely upset if your son or daughter married someone of the opposite political party? And the percentage of people in the 60s who said they would be extremely upset was about 5%. It was very low. Now, they asked that same question a couple of years ago. It's about 35%. And I think that's because partisan label has become a shorthand for worldview, that it encapsulates a much wider understanding of, it's not just choosing a party one way or the other. It's a declaration about a whole way of looking on the world and on culture and which issues are important in our broad cultural and societal life as well as our political life. And for all those reasons, there has been a separation of the parties, and so that you cannot effectively find a Catholic candidate for any national level of office who has a nomination of a major party. They do not exist.
If we could pick up on that too, that notion of the automatically homeless sense of the Catholic voter, and also think of the major teaching document on election from the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, issued during every presidential election year, is called Faithful Citizenship. So in that document, the bishops are clear in saying we're not telling Catholics for whom or for what to vote. So Bishop McElroy, how does a Catholic, in that sense of homelessness with the freedom to make up their own mind, what's a way by which they can navigate this turbulent time we're in to kind of use their conscience to vote in a responsible way, informed by their Catholic faith?
Well, I'd say starting out with the first words of the title of that document, which are forming consciences, okay? Elections and voting, especially for candidates, are questions of conscience. They come and lie within the realm of right of the voter to pray about, to think about, to weigh all the different issues, and then come to a conclusion as which candidates you think can best advance the common good because of their stances, because of their character, because of their competence, because of their leadership qualities. So you're picking particular candidates based on that. But it is the formation of consciences which the church is about, not the proclamation of criteria for voting that are truncated editions of the common good and that are presented as mandates for the Catholic voter. Okay, and I would distinguish between those two things. So what the church seeks to do is conscious formation, but it's in the conscience of the individual. Now, a practical way I think of in terms of voting in this, and I sometimes think of myself in this regard. After all the looking at the issues, and faithful citizenship presents a very full-bodied survey of Catholic social teaching, and of all the issues that need to be taken into account, all the major issues that form the common good now. But I like to think of it this way, and sometimes people ask me, how should I vote? I often say to people, well, you know, when you sit down to fill out your ballot or when you're in the voting place, think to yourself that Jesus is right beside you. And just ask yourself, who do I think Jesus would guide me toward? And that helps filter out self-interest. It helps filter out tribalism. You know, we've become so visceral about our politics. It's like we have teams and that we want to stomp on the other team and all this. But that notion, if Jesus were by our side, what would he be guiding us toward? That, I think, summarizes what the goal of for the faithful Catholic is, in their conscience, speaking with God, speaking with Jesus, trying to come to a conclusion, which candidate is best for our society at this and for the world. So,
thank you so much. Father O'Brien.
Do you have any? I love. Actually, I'm really caught by that image, Bob, of sort of bringing Jesus in with you into the polling place, or if you're marking your ballot at home, as sort of a way of getting above the fray. I wonder what you would tell. You know, we're on a college campus here, and we have a number of new voters. So are those who have turned 18 or are first-year students primarily. What advice would you give to someone voting for the first time, or frankly, those who might be disaffected by what they're hearing and turned off to vote, but you really need encouragement to vote? Do you want to speak to young people in particular?
Well, I remember back to my own first time voting, which was and I hate to say this, in 1972, and it was Richard Nixon and George McGovern. But and I had a sense of intensity about it at that time, and I was in Boston in college, and among students there was a lot of enthusiasm. But we could get together then. We weren't in the COVID world, where there'd be large protests and gatherings and everything. So it was an exciting time in terms of voting that way, and students on both sides, gathered together. Debates occurred, and so all of that is good, when that happens. That kind of understanding that you can affect the system. I think one of the reasons why this particular election is so consequential is that there is an increasing view that you can't affect the system, that your vote doesn't make a difference. And I would say, there's a certain rational benefit analysis where you say, is my vote going to change the? Almost certainly not. But voting is a moral participation in our society. It's a way of shouldering the responsibility of citizenship. And, that was when our country was founded. We forget this from time to time, but there was no democratic type of republic in the whole world. Everything was more or less a monarchy of some type. There was no democracy of any nation in the world. Okay, we think of Britain as being, but it was a monarchy, of course. And so the founders had to wrestle with this question: how can we put together a system where the people genuinely have rule? And what they kept was imperfect because their notion of citizenship was limited and is certain. crucial ways. They were blinded to things because of their culture and class and issues of slavery. But this idea that they had, that democracy is something that you participate in, and it will only work if people participate in it. So the reason to vote is not your vote is going to tip it one way or the other. It's rather, as we do in so many important social interactions at all levels in our society and church and everything, we participate in it as a way of continuing to keep life in the democratic way of doing things and of decision making. And that to me is the reason to participate, is the reason to vote. It's because there is something beautiful and noble about it. And it's like so many things in life. When we participate in them, we do something good in and of itself. So that would just be my thought.
That's a beautiful thought. I know David's got a question, but I just was drawing a connection in my head between our call for students to wear masks as an expression of care for the common good, care for the community, not simply themselves, and a call to vote for the good of the community. So I like that connection.
I just want to say on that mask initiative, to me, the mask is an interesting thing because it is purely, in my understanding, unless we're talking about I-95 masks, but with masks, the type of mask we all wear in general, you do it solely to protect others. You're not doing it for self-protection. You're doing it solely as an act of benevolence on behalf of others. And that's why it's more beautiful for that reason, to me. Now I wish it could protect both ways, but it's a beautiful thing to wear a mask because it's not for yourself, it's for everybody and the society as a whole, of course.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thinking of the phrase I know moral theologian Kathy Caveney likes to use, that in voting we are all both sovereign and subject in some way simultaneously. I think that's a very striking thing to consider. Bishop McElroy, I'm wondering if we could touch for a few minutes here on kind of the elephant in the room, or maybe not so much the elephant because we all know about it, but abortion and voting, which has certainly come, for better or worse, to be one of the great political stories of Catholicism and the election. So in that same document from the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, Faithful Citizenship, the phrase is used that abortion is the preeminent issue. But also in the same document, there's a quotation from Pope Francis that indicates it's not. I'm wondering if you could comment on that. Is abortion the preeminent moral issue a Catholic ought to bring to the voting booth? Or is there a broader range of important issues that really ought to guide a Catholic voter?
My own view is that there are three, but I'm speaking knowing that others think differently, that there are three preeminent issues at the present moment in this election. One is abortion, one is climate change, and one is the culture of exclusion in our nation at the present, which is, racism, class exclusion, and ethnic exclusion. So I look on those as all the preeminent issues. And the problem with the word preeminent in that document, I think, is this. Preeminent is a very imprecise word. It can mean two very different things. It can be the most important among, or it can be, it's determinative in Catholic, it's so important, it's determinative in Catholic voting. Okay. Many people who are using preeminent now, citing that passage, are using it in a way that the church teaching does not support, which is namely they are saying that abortion is singularly determinative for the Catholic conscience on who to vote for. In and of itself, it is the one issue that if you have a candidate who supports legal sanctions against abortion and another one who does not, They say that fact alone means you have to vote for the candidate who is supportive of legal sanctions. As I say, well, Catholic teaching does not support that position, that it is singularly determinative in the Catholic conscience and forms a singular mandate on the Catholic conscience for voting. But that's how people are often presenting it in these days. Abortion is a terrible reality in our society. It's the direct taking of innocent human life on a massive level. And we have not handled it well, either legislatively or juridically on this question. And so there is a mandate in Catholic teaching for candidates across the board, it doesn't matter whether they're Catholic or not, for candidates to seek legal sanctions against abortion. There is that mandate. And it is an important element on the Catholic conscience of voters to weigh that as the grave moral reality it is. But it's not a substitute for the general common good. You can't reduce Catholic social teaching or the common good to the issue of abortion. That is not consistent with the Catholic tradition. So it's a very important issue. And I regret always candidates and good people I've known well, who are faithful Catholics, who have spoken to me about this issue in their own life, in their own candidacies, who do not support legal sanctions on abortion because, going back to the homelessness thing, as a Democrat, they can't do that and win a primary. And so, but it needs to be immensely prominent in the evaluation, the moral evaluation of the issues for a Catholic voter and from Catholic teaching, but it is not singularly determinative of how Catholics are mandated to vote by the gospel of Christ.
On that same issue, Bishop McElroy, in popular media, as well as, of course, in academic journals and church documents, the phrase is often used, abortion is an intrinsic evil, and therefore it must be opposed in the sense of there is a single issue on which Catholics ought to vote. Abortion as an intrinsic evil ought to be the singular kind of controlling factor in for whom one votes. Could you comment on that term, since it's gotten a certain popular, so to speak, cachet, and what does it mean, and what is its significance compared even to other terms like the common good?
Intrinsic evil has no place in public policy discussions. You can't have intrinsically evil legislation and public policy. Intrinsic evil is a category of theological analysis that looks on certain acts. It says, Catholic teaching says, certain acts are always and everywhere wrong. Abortion, for example, is an act of abortion is always and everywhere wrong. There's not a justification for it. Torture, for example, always and everywhere wrong. So those are called intrinsically evil acts. And they cannot ever be undertaken as an action. But the category of intrinsic evil does not translate to legislation, because in these acts which are intrinsically evil, they're very, the moral structure of the act is very clear and simple and limited. You know, it's the taking of an innocent human life, okay, or in torture, it's the degradation of human dignity on such a level that can never be justified. So, but the question of whether you would have legislation, what legislation should be pursued to remedy even one of these evils, does not fall into the analysis of intrinsic evil because it's too complex. Okay, with abortion, for example, what sanctions do you enact in terms of abortion? What's the problem? Should there be criminal penalties for the mother, for the doctor, for the staff? Should there be civil penalties and fines for those people? What do you do in rape, incest, life of the mother and the law? All these questions are not capable of analysis under this category of intrinsically evil. So that category should never be used in any discussion of public policy, really, because it describes acts that are so simple in terms of their moral structure that you can look at them and they're self-evident in that way. Whereas, for example, on abortion, the same bill, which in one context, say you had a law which said you sanction the doctor with fines for abortion, okay, and there'll be $500, okay, and then you say, well, that's a good thing to pass, okay. Then somebody comes in with a bill saying it's only be $250, all right. What would be right to vote for in one context is not for another, or different penalties you might impose, so that the context is important. And in the issue of intrinsic evil, context is irrelevant. Circumstances are irrelevant in the question of intrinsic evil. Now, has that been helpful, David, or do I need to clarify that? Or
I think that's very helpful, actually. And I was wondering if you might also just even pick up a little from what you're saying. A term that has become also more a part of kind of the Catholic vernacular in the US of late is the term prudence, the virtue of prudence. And I think for many people, prudence is something like, well, be prudent, don't do something stupid when you go outside. But it really has this very rich tradition in the Catholic moral tradition that seems like more and more people are trying to bring back into our conversation. And I know you've written about this and all. Could you comment on what is prudence and how can that help a Catholic voter as they think about these complex issues?
Sure. And as the lead into that, I want to mention that it ties into this question you had on intrinsic evil, because in the conversation politically now, many people say, oh, this is an issue of intrinsic evil, say abortion or assisted suicide. But the other issues, climate change, which can end all of humanity potentially, that's only a matter of prudence, prudential judgment, which they think of as a lesser thing. And it has nothing to do with what's the more important issue. Because the category of intrinsic evil doesn't measure where the graver evil is. That is, a single act of comprehension, of contraception, is intrinsically evil. Launching a nuclear arms race is not. Now, you tell me which is a graver evil, a single act of contraception or launching a nuclear arms race. So it's just categories that don't make sense for public policy. Intrinsic evil doesn't make sense. And what is contrasted with is this notion, the nuclear war issue or the question of climate change or poverty or racism. See, racism is an interesting one because in Catholic teaching, racism is intrinsically evil, which is interesting because in this political discussion, all that will get spoken of as intrinsically evil by those who are proponents of this approach. It'll be abortion, it'll be religious liberty, it'll be marriage, and they'll say those are intrinsic evil. But they don't mention that Pope John Paul II himself in his encyclical Veritatis Splendor, and then the Vatican Council said racism is also intrinsically evil, meaning always and everywhere wrong. Undignified living conditions for men and women and families. That's all intrinsic evil, always and everywhere wrong. Improper working conditions are listed as intrinsically evil, always and everywhere wrong. So, but the beauty of prudence is, even though it gets dismissed by those who attack and say, oh, it's just prudential. Prudence is the way we make all our decisions. All right. It's so important. St. Thomas Aquinas thought of prudence as, in a way, the most important of the issues. He called it the charioteer of the virtues, because it keeps them all in balance. Prudence in Catholic theology is that sense we have inside of us that guides us to perceive goodness or to perceive evil, and to know which is which and how we should move. That's what prudence does. It's a magnificently important and beautiful virtue in the life of every human being. And so prudence has a rich history and role in contemporary. It's how we make decisions. And as I say, not in the surface way we often do this. When I was a kid, I remember sometimes I'd want to do something and it wouldn't, part of me knew it wasn't the right thing to do, but I would convince myself, rationalization is the great enemy of prudence. And I would convince myself by rationalizing that, well, what I wanted to do and what was my self-interest to also was the right thing to do. And every once in a while, my mother would get wind of something like this, and she had this very deflating response to me, and she'd say, now, Bob, what would Jesus do? And I didn't always know what Jesus would do, but I knew it was darn well not what I wanted to do and not what I was intending to do. So prudence is that which guides us and helps us, again, eliminating rationalization and self-interest, to know what is the right way to move forward. Where lie the better angels of our nature? That's what prudence brings to us. So it's a beautiful quality of the human soul and spirit.
And Bob, if I can amplify on that, I think when I teach theology, particularly moral theology, to younger people, and when I talk about the virtue of prudence, in one sense, it's a call to responsibility. I think some people, young and old, like to be told, well, you're Catholic, so vote this way. Well, that's easy, but it's also an abdication of our moral authority, which I think God wants us to exercise. So I think what you're describing, I think what really the richness of Catholic moral teaching, particularly on voting, says, we got to step up. We have got to listen. We got to learn the issues. We got to really think about the candidates. We got to do the work so that we can be informed and make a decision as an exercise of our moral authority, which is a prudential judgment, knowing that we could be in the end right or wrong, but we at least got to own the decision.
That's right. Yeah.
And I think that's what we're calling, going back to my first question to you about younger people voting for the first time, we're actually saying, to step up and take responsibility, because all the issues you've raised, I think about climate change and how our young people are so invested, and it's this planet that we're ruining for them, right? And how these things matter, so many issues matter to them, but to take the responsibility to learn the ins and outs of a certain policy, particularly in California, well, frankly, those propositions are so sometimes challenging to understand, but we're asked to vote if we can. I think it's a call to moral responsibility, Bob.
Yeah, no, I did. I was a delegate to the Synod on the Amazon last October, and on this environmental question and climate change. It was fascinating to see, because they had people all over the world, in addition to the bishops who were there, mostly from the Amazon, but they had experts from all over the world on this. And to see within the science, the absolute leadership of the scientific community around the world, many of whom were present for that, and the leadership of young people from around the world. What a sense there is of the risks that lie before us, and this question of tipping point, which is not far off, and when it becomes irredeemable. And there really was a sense among all of us in the room that unless, religious communities, young people, and the scientific community together form an effective outreach to help bring this message and the reality from the scientific community, of course, and the sense of the presence of God in the creation from the religious communities and what's at stake there, and then for young people, and in the sense that this is their future. For all of us, the three of us are not young anymore, but it is the future of young people which is at stake, and that's what we need to form a coalition on.
Bishop McElroy, I wonder if I could jump back also. You mentioned of these racism, and the history of the Catholic Church in the U.S. around racism in some ways isn't so good. I'm wondering, what did you think as you watched the video of George Floyd, in thinking of your position as a teacher in the church, as the Bishop of San Diego?
Well, when I was watching the tape, frankly, the two thoughts I had were I wanted to turn away because it was so sickening. And you saw this unfolding. Of course, you knew the result before you watched the tape, but you thought, screaming out, do something. Doesn't somebody jump forward and say, stop this, But it's easy to do when you're far away. And so it was, I think, to anybody who watches that thing, it's a horrific reality. And the church is not immune in any sense from racism, either for us as a community of people, as a community of faith, for priests and bishops, for the institution of life of the church, has failed in enormous ways on this. Now, what we've been doing in California, the bishops of California have undertaken a consultation on this question, where we've been having sessions where all of us meet with African American men and women from different sectors of society and backgrounds and in the church and all, and listen simply to their stories of how racism has impacted their life, and significant stories of racism within the life of the church and how it's impacted their life. And some of them were stunning. So we're beginning, starting in January, a broader dialogue within our church communities as a whole to bring this to the parish level. But our stance at this point is simply to begin by listening to these experiences. It's like after that tape, it's a shocking thing, but then we've got to know what is the reality that people are experiencing. In the wake of the George Floyd death, when he was killed, I had a mass with the leadership of the African American Catholic community here in our diocese. And of course, it's COVID time, and most of them are elderly, but a number of them came, and COVID was already hitting that community particularly savagely. So, but when I was talking to the leadership, through mass with distance, what struck me, these are very balanced, accomplished people, and how they had a sense of the racism that they had seen in the life of society and the life of the church all of these years of their life, and their frustration that it never ends, and their skepticism, their hope, but their skepticism that this chapter will be any different. And that was, to me, that was very difficult to listen to from them, because many of them I know. But there's a sense of that, and we have to be attuned to that. I think by listening and learning, and then figuring out structurally how do we change this set of realities.
We're getting some questions coming in from our viewers, and so I've got one here that I think speaks to, I suppose, the role of a bishop in terms of managing the priests, employees of a diocese. And a listener said, how do you address what the listener called a spiritual abuse that could be committed by priests who tell a congregation how they should vote?
Well, I do it by calling the priest. And it is, we have, I don't want to say this too, well, here I am. I was going to say, I don't want to say it too publicly, but here I am saying it publicly. This year, we have not had a significant problem in that regard, to my knowledge, in the Diocese of San Diego. We, last time around in 2016, we did. And I had to intervene. And I intervened in it, and I had to silence the priest from speaking at all about any of these issues or having any in the bulletin of any type and all this. And it got so out of hand that it appeared as a skit on Saturday Night Live, and they even brought back Church Lady to reenact this incident in San Diego. But the one thing that really helped me was last time. This was an incident where the priest was telling, well, in the bulletin insert, it said that Catholics who vote democratically will go to hell. I mean, it was pretty blatant stuff. So, so I had dealt with this, but I lucked out because in dealing with this, then I got a call from somebody who said, another priest, actually was deacon in the diocese, had given a homily in which it was all but an endorsement of Secretary Clinton. So I thought, oh, good, So I called and talked to him too, and told him he can't do this stuff. So, but at least I had some sense of balance on this. So when you ask to respond to the question, what would I as a bishop do if a priest is endorsing a particular candidate and telling people they have to vote this way, that I would say I would have to call them and tell them you can't do that.
Thank you. Father O'Brien, if you wanted to jump in.
As I was thinking about prudence more, I think part of our prudential judgment, we let's say we have a goal that we agree on, right? But there might be different paths to get there. And isn't that part of prudential judgment, that you might say, well, it could be that the courts are the avenue to that end.
Right. Yeah.
Maybe the local office or state office is really the impact. It doesn't really matter who I vote for nationally or vice versa, right? So I think that's part of the calculus.
Exactly. Yeah.
Again, it's not easy. So you can say, well, again, no perfect candidate, but if you want an end on whatever issue you name, you got to think about how best to get there, right?
Oh yeah,
and it's just, that's why it takes a lot of preparation as we vote.
And prudence is fundamentally a disposition of the heart, but it's also a disposition of the mind, because for that very reason you mentioned, Father Brad, that analysis comes into play. That it's not enough just to have the right intention,
right, or
the right discernment of the heart. It also needs to be a discernment of how to get it done.
Right. Can I ask you a question about, I think we've all experienced that, and you named it really, politically, there's been more tribalism and divisiveness in the body politic, but we've also seen that reflected in the church. And I think that can be, again, about our younger people, can be so disedifying and not very attractive when we start to argue. And that's why a public minister in the church should not be endorsing a candidate, right?
That's right. That's precisely why we should, but also because not just that it causes, it makes the church look bad, but also, and more fundamentally, because it's not our right or our mission to tell people how to vote. It is our right and our mission to help inform the conscience according to the gospel and the teaching of the church. That is, but informing is different than determining.
Right. Well, I guess this is where I'm leading is, and you've been within the American Catholic Church for many years, sort of one who's trying to build bridges and find common ground, and sort of you don't buy into the tribalism that we can find in the church as well as in the body politic. Do you have a sense of, as we look beyond this election and we continue in this papacy in our American context, what do you think is the best antidote to tribalism within the Catholic Church, between progressives and traditionalists, conservatives, liberals, all those things which frankly are alienating to a lot of young people?
Sure. Yeah. I wrote an article about a year ago where I suggested the Church of the United States should have a synod on these very questions. Mm-hmm. How do we heal the divisions we have? How do we deal with the issues of real significance that confront us? And I listed a few of them. Because I was much taken by the process of the synod, how conciliatory it was, and at the same time, we confronted issues that were divisive. So I do think that's a good model for it. And I do think, as I said at that time, I think we need to do this and should do something like this. Because we just gone through a process in the Church of the United States called Encuentro, which is for the Hispanic communities, which are almost now a majority of the Catholics in the country. It was a wonderful process. It was synodal in its design and structure and end. And it was a wonderful process because people came together at the parish, began with parish input, diocesan input, regional input, and then national. And it just left such a good spirit, but things came out of it. It produced something too. And sometimes bridging those things that are divisive in the life of the church. So that's a really good model of how we could do it, but we need to do it. And our nation's going to need to do it too. I don't know what will happen, but I know it should happen, because no matter who wins this election, on the other side of the inauguration, we need to have some process of healing, and that's going to have to be very creative and sustained, and bringing together people who are on opposite sides, because that's the more important thing than the election, if you ask me. It's are we able to heal and get past this cycle of turmoil and division?
I'd like to pick up on that too, in light of a major teaching document from Pope Francis he issued earlier this month, the Italian name Fratelli Tutti, or social friendship. Because I wonder if it has themes that maybe pick up some of what Father O'Brien's questions are pointing toward. And are there things in that document, Bishop McElroy, that we could sort of draw on to inform this possibility of healing in the aftermath of the election?
I think there are a couple. The document is really a summary in many ways of themes of the Pope's writings during his time as Pope. But see, there are a couple. One is the document has a long section on the parable of the Good Samaritan. And in that section, he reflects upon the fact that when the Samaritan comes down the side of the road, he had every reason not to stop. He was not of the same religious or national group of the man lying by the side of the road, because he was in a foreign territory. The priest and the Levite who had gone before him didn't stop. And yet he not only stops and is filled with compassion, he acts on it. And he acts at some risk to himself. We don't get this because we've heard the parable of the Good Samaritan so often. But when the Good Samaritan stops there, he doesn't know if the robbers are still around, whether this guy's just faking it and it's a trap. He doesn't. So he's risking himself deeply to help this man whom he doesn't know or have any tie to or attachment to, not even from the same society. And what the Pope is saying in this encyclical is we need to have compassion like that, and in our own lives and in our political lives. Now, our compassion is deliberately constricted in our political structure. You know, that we're called to have, in reality, because of our political divisions, we have compassion for either the child in the womb or the child separated from his parents at the border. And we have compassion, you know, either for the person who is the victim of racial violence or the business owner whose violence is it. Our society categorizes these sufferings differently. And thus, when you notice on the ads and things and how people present, only one half of the picture's presented. Even our compassion is truncated along political lines. And that's a bad thing. The Pope says it's important to run against. So I say this first thing, yes, it is compassion. The second is solidarity, you know, which is in American life, solidarity is the understanding that you are debtors of the society of which you are a part. That before you say what's there for me, you say what grace I have received from this society in which I live, and start with that. And thus that gets back to your similar point, Father Brian. You know, it's partly understanding that graced reality of being a member of the society here, with all its flaws. That giving back is voting. You know, that's one of the ways. And political responsibility is part of that notion of solidarity. And so it has to do with patriotism, which in our country is not a matter of ties of blood. Most countries, patriotism is related to ties of blood. Ours, it isn't. It never has been. It is aspirational. It is looking at the set of ideals which our founders put out at the beginning, limited as they were in their scope and blinded by certain cultural factors and class factors. But looking at those ideals and trying to make them ever more a reality in the world in which we live. So our patriotism is not a possession, it's an aspiration, and we need to live that way. And that's what the Pope says on solidarity. And the final one is dialogue. He keeps talking about dialogue. Dialogue means you've got to listen. And just as importantly, dialogue means you got to really believe that the person you're dialoguing with, that there's a great potential that she or he has something to offer you that'll help inform you and may change you in some ways. So I think those three things are really important for our society and for our politics in Fratelli Tutti.
Well, compassion, solidarity, and dialogue sound like great notes to end this wonderful conversation on. Father O'Brien, thank you so much for joining us, and wonderful to have you here. And Bishop McElroy, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. I wanted to just note one thing. Our dear colleague at the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics, Hannah Callahan, passed away suddenly in January of this year. And Hannah was our director of government ethics, beloved by all of us. Hannah has a book that she could just completed before her death called Voting for Ethics. And it's a nonpartisan guide on how to think about ethics in voting for everyone from your local school board to the President of the United States. So I encourage all the viewers of this to please check out Hannah's book. Information about it is available on the website of the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics, and that is at www.scu.edu/ethics. Hannah Callahan's book, Voting for Ethics. Well, I'm going to say goodbye to both Bishop McElroy and Father O'Brien. Thank you so, so much for being with us for this wonderful conversation on Catholicism, the 2020 election. We look forward to seeing you again soon, Bishop McElroy, and a blessing on both of your days. And thank you all to our viewers for being with us. We look forward to having you join us for more conversations down the road. I'm David DeCosse, the Director of Religious and Catholic Ethics at the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics at Santa Clara University.